800 is our number. Is government too big, a burden to society, and a threat to individual liberties, or is it too ineffective a protector of average people, co-opted by big business and moneyed interests? We welcome your answer to that question. If you'd like to join our conversation in this hour with David Rothkopf, our toll-free long-distance number, 866-661-9309. Questions by email welcome at midday at wypr.org. Welcome back to Midday. Dan Roderick's here. Part 2 of our discussion, The Future of Global Power, today with David Rothkopf. His book, Power Incorporated, The Epic Rivalry Between Big Business and Government and the Reckoning That Lies Ahead. In this book, David, you quote Robert Rubin, because you were just speaking of that time of the Clinton years. He's the former, of course, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. And you have an exchange with him on this phrase, too big to fail. You ask in the book, asked about whether the biggest and most influential financial organizations ought to be broken up, whether being too big to fail really was a problem to be addressed. He shook his head and said, no, don't you see? Too big to fail isn't a problem with the system, it is the system. What did he mean by that?
Well, he meant that giant corporations that are operating in dozens or scores of countries around the world need to have giant financial institutions that are also operating in those kind of countries to service them. They need to be able to mobilize giant amounts of capital to be able to satisfy the needs of those corporations. And so the idea of, that's why banks had to consolidate. That's why, in his view, they had to make available the full range of services that both banks and investment banks did, and so on. And so he, and I don't think, I don't attribute malice to him or callousness. I think he was simply reporting on the facts of globalization and economic progress as he saw them. But of course, there's a serious consequence to that. When a bank is too big to fail and it does falter, what happens? Well, either the government has to write a check to keep it from failing, and thus people at large are on the hook for these institutions that are only benefiting their shareholders and particularly their top executives. Or alternatively, the bank fails and it causes financial catastrophe and people are put out of work and growth slows, and there is another kind of social consequence. So, as a consequence, we have this system not just of sort of liabilities and assets that are on a balance sheet someplace, but all of us are on the hook for the financial community because they are so essential to our daily economic lives that if they make a big mistake, and they always do, we end up having to pay for it.
It's self-inflicted, these failings, right? Pretty much?
Of course, but
yeah.
Look, the objective of these companies is to increase their bottom line. Human nature lets greed get the best of them. We are in, the world is a history of boom and bust cycles. They almost always overreach, partially because if everybody's doing it, it doesn't look like it's overreaching. It looks like conventional wisdom, and things blow up. And then they blow up, and who's the fire department? You and me.
Right. The taxpayers, the government,
right.
but
right.
the word accountability needs to be in here somewhere. Another thing that distinguishes these corporations is they have no accountability to anyone but their shareholders, stockholders.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, right? And part of the book is that I go back to the beginning of time, and where did corporations come from? They didn't evolve like us, from single-celled creatures. We created them, and we created corporations to serve the state. The objective initially was that the initial corporations served kings, but over time the idea was that a state gave a charter to an economic enterprise that it thought would benefit the state. And initially these were trading companies, or they built bridges or operated toll roads. But at a certain point, they started shrugging off the control of the state and becoming more and more independent creatures. This started in the U.S. in the early part of the 19th century. There was a decision about Dartmouth College's charter. There was a debate over it, and the Supreme Court said, no, once the state gives the charter out, the company's independent. And then gradually, over time, corporations used the law and their size and their political influence, and they began to acquire more and more independent rights. In fact, the Lincoln's legacy is the 14th Amendment, gives people equal protection under the law. Well, in the first 50 years after the 14th Amendment was passed at the end of the 19th century, most of the cases brought before the Supreme Court that invoked the 14th Amendment were by companies seeking rights for companies. And that's how you get today to Citizens United, where you have the Supreme Court saying, oh, no, the government doesn't have the right to stop a company from writing big checks in terms of political campaigns because corporations have a right of free speech. That corporations aren't even real. They're a legal fiction. But somehow they're not mentioned in the Constitution, but somehow they have acquired over time the rights that people once had. And because they live forever and they have more money, they obviously end up with more political influence unless you take steps to control it. And we just aren't taking those steps.
David Rothkopf is our guest in this hour of midday. 410-662-8780 if you'd like to get in on this conversation about his new book, Power Incorporated, The Epic Rivalry Between Big Business and Government and the Reckoning That Lies Ahead. David Rothkopf, among other roles and titles, is a CEO and editor-in-chief of the Foreign Policy magazine, in print and online, of course. So do you mind telling the story of the goat with the red horns? Because I wanted to tell folks the book is rich with history on the evolution of the corporation, the multinational, but I can't resist asking you about the goat with the red horns.
Well, I'm glad you asked about the goat with the red horns.
It's a good story.
I almost called the book The Goat with the Red Horns, but the publisher thought it would be misleading. But I wanted to go back to the origins. I wanted to, as we were just talking a moment ago, I wanted to sort of see what the original concept of was a corporation and try to figure out how we got to where we are. And I started going back further and further in history, and I came upon this story of this goat herd in the middle of Sweden in the Viking days, before the year 1000, whose goat wandered away from him. And came back a couple of hours later and had bright red horns. And the goat herd thought this was a little strange and followed the path the goat took and discovered a little stream. And in the stream was orange, reddish, cloudy liquid that the goat had been drinking from. And so he dug down, and what he discovered, of course, in the stream was copper. And the copper was part of a vein of copper that was in a mountain that ultimately became known as the Great Copper Mountain, Stora Kopparberg. And Stora Kopparberg was also the name that mountain gave to a corporation the Swedish government of the time established to mine the mountain and create the wealth that ultimately became the Swedish Empire and gave us a variety of things, including the copper roof at Versailles. So Stora Kopparberg is the oldest corporation still in existence in the world today. Today it's called Stora Enso. It's not in the copper business anymore. And I think telling of the evolution of companies, it's not even really in Sweden anymore. The headquarters are in Finland and in the UK. It controls land roughly half the size of Belgium. It's got sales that make it bigger than 80 or 90 of the countries in the world in terms of resources. When it had a problem in the Brazilian rainforest, the Brazilian government turned to it to do the police work that the Brazilian government used to do. And so even though it's small and it's obscure, it is a kind of an every company, and that's kind of how I used it. It's kind of following its story. And, of course, I follow a lot of other stories, but following it sort of reveals the evolution of the company from something very deliberately created to serve the state to something that has today become a rival of the state. And, taking us from what we had in the year 1000, where the biggest rivalry was between church and state, to after that was resolved, almost immediately getting into one between public power and private power.
It's so interesting. It was, if you say, very deliberately established by the state to serve the state. So what happened? What had happened in that history of Storaberg?
Well, it grew and
beyond the power of the state.
Well, ultimately, it had to shrug off the power of state became constrained by constitutions and people seeking to reign in the state, which is a good thing. You don't want too much state power, but the company, sort of shaking loose from being controlled by the state, began to look for ways that it could sustain itself even after the copper in the mountain ran out, and it found businesses around the world. And in fact, at the end of the 19th century, it had a CEO who emulated Andrew Carnegie and the American robber barons of the era and developed, the sort of techniques for growing his company based on watching them. And so at the end of the day, you ended up having a company, like lots of others, that sort of shrugged off the controls of the public enterprises, the states that had actually created them. And it's led us to a point today in the world where those private enterprises are growing and growing in power, and many states have fallen away from the kind of power they used to have. I call them in the book semi-states, because the things that you used to associate with a country, like printing money or controlling borders or projecting force or enforcing the law, many states in the world can't really do anymore, because the internet's made borders irrelevant, or because only a few countries print money, or only a half a dozen or a dozen and a half countries can project force, or because if you're a global company and somebody passes a law, you can always say, something, I'm going to go someplace else. I don't have to be subject to your laws because I'm mobile in a way that you as a government aren't. Mm-hmm. And that's created this world in which there are states, 30 or 40, that are big and do what states used to do, super citizens, a couple thousand big companies that operate as no other entities have in the past, and semi-states, 150 or so small governments that really can't even compete with these big companies for power or influence.
David Rothkopf, our guest here on Midday. Let's take a call. Lindsay in Baltimore. We welcome our listeners to join us at 410-662-8780. Lindsay, thanks for calling Midday.
Hi, Dan. Hi, David. I have a question about how this relates to this conversation relates to Phil Bobbitt's theory about the market state, that we're going through a paradigm shift, that the Westphalian state is being replaced by what he calls the market state, and that this role reversal, that instead of the corporation serving the state, the state is actually serving the corporation. And what I worry about is, what about the people who aren't market competitive in a market state? And maybe we need to revision the state, not have less state. We just need to revision the state.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. The reality is we need states. States provide valuable services. There are some services only a state can provide. States are the ones that level the playing field. States are the ones that look out for public interest. But, after you sort of leave, freshman in college, political science, nobody ever asks the question, why do we have a state? But if you were to look at the way the U.S. operates, you would conclude the reason we have a state is to create wealth for everybody, to create a high GDP. But, of course, a high GDP is something that doesn't reflect whether you've got an equal or an unequal society, and it doesn't reflect the well-being of everybody or whether you've got a just society. And maybe the reason you have a state is to create better lives for people. And if that's true, then you need some actor that's acting in the interests of the people at large and not responding simply to the market, which, after all, doesn't have a conscience, and which seeks things like efficiency, and therefore it promotes scale, and scale makes it hard for competition to occur once it's achieved, and thus markets, while they do have the capacity to create opportunity, also have the capacity to quash it if they are allowed to follow their course without any kind of regulation or legal system to ensure balance.